Welcome to session 3. And this is an interesting session because it's something that we're all worried about. How secure is Aadhaar? How secure are our bank accounts? How secure are we as Indian citizens? To bring it back to session 1. So it's our pleasure to invite Rahul, Matthan and Vinay Kesari on the session What is Privacy? Just half an intro. Rahul has just finished Privacy 3.0 publication. So we have a lot that we're going to learn about privacy and how careful we need to be.
Thank you so much, Chief. So, we chatted about this and there's no interview or interview, we're just going to have a conversation. I've known Vinay, when I first knew of him, he was in a competing law firm, and in India, when you're in a competing law firms, you're not supposed to even acknowledge the presence of the other. But then this wonderful thing happened, which is, the Aadhaar and privacy and technology, and this community of tech policy people grew. And it's wonderful to see right now there is a thick group of privacy and technology, legal and policy professionals who interact with each other a lot over the years. And Vinay and I have met on many occasions. So that was the idea to sit together. The other thing is he's got a great VR headset rig, and I'm a tech geek, and so that's another part of the reason I wanted to chat with
And Rahul, of course, all of you know him, but all of you know him as a technology and privacy expert. But the fact is, he's also he's the founder of one of India's biggest and most successful law firms. He's someone that people like me looked up to back when we were in law school. One, in terms of how to found and run a law firm driven by merit in a world that is still largely family driven. And secondly, someone who managed to carve a niche for himself in the area of technology and a practice called TMT, which did not exist about 15 years ago. And he created that space for people like me to come in and inhabit more easily. So apart from being a tech pundit, he by the way also happens to run one of India's largest law firms. That's something he doesn't really talk about much, but that's really what he's known for in legal circles. So
yeah. So what we thought we'd do is talk about some of the technologies and some of the issues that are troubling us. Some of the things that she mentioned, but a lot more. Some of the things that we heard in the previous session on China, and hopefully a lot more. But I thought I'd start by just going back to the premise on which I wrote the book. And that is, if you've read the book, or if you're interested in reading the book essentially goes through the history of privacy in human civilization, in that sense. And what I propose in that book is that actually this whole concept of privacy that we're so bothered about today is an extremely new concept in the context of human civilization. So if you look back to early human civilizations, we lived so close to each other that there was really no privacy. There was no concept of privacy because people expected to know everything about their neighbors, because if they didn't know everything about their neighbors, that neighbor perhaps is someone who is conspiring to do something which would be against the interests of the tribe. And so that whole concept of knowing things about each other was very much part of the survival of early humans. And if you look at nature, it's very much part of the survival of nature. I mean, animals can't keep secrets from each other. They actually have to work together, and the animal that is secretive or does something contrary to the tribe is the animal who's going to get the rest of the tribe in danger. And so when you start thinking about what created privacy and what was the reason for privacy, in the book I mentioned this concept. The origins of privacy came when we actually built walls. We always had walls, but walls that were substantial, stone walls, through which you couldn't hear people, you couldn't see what was happening. And the premise that I posit in the book, and you see it occurring again and again, is that it is technology and the evolution of technology that keeps pushing our concept of privacy further and further. So if you think about the first right to privacy, which was articulated in the US, that was articulated by a person who went on to become one of the most libertarian, liberal judges of the United States, and that is Brandeis. Essentially, what he said is privacy is a fundamental right in response to photography, to the fact that before then, you could walk about on the street and no one could take a photograph of you and know what you're doing. But the moment Eastman invented the portable camera, there were journalists on the streets, like paparazzi, essentially the first paparazzi, taking photographs of you in your private moments. Of course, we didn't have this conception of there's privacy in the home and on the street, anyone can take a photograph, because cameras were just invented. And so we had to reconceptualize the concept of privacy because a new technology came in. And then it happened again with the telephones. When the telephones came in, we had to reconceptualize the fact that a conversation that happens in our living room, you have a natural expectation that no one other than the people in the living room will hear it. And the telephone was thought in the early days to be an extension of it. That all you needed to do was speak to the other person on the telephone, and you could be sure that no one else would listen. And then, of course, they started tapping the phones. And so we had to reconceptualize our notion of what it means to have a private conversation in the context of a new technology. And this happens again and again, and the internet is only the latest. Aadhaar is a new manifestation of that. The premise in the book is, as much as we today are getting agitated about the fact that our privacy is being violated by technology, I wanted to reassure readers that we have been agitated in the same way time and again. Ever since the concept of privacy came about, we have been agitated about it. We will be agitated now, and in time this will pass, and a new technology will come to make us agitated again in our new context. But Vinay doesn't agree with me.
Yeah, no, in part, but not completely. I do agree that the concept of privacy is something that has, I think, evolved and become important only at a later stage in the evolution of society. But I would posit that is true of many of the rights that we see as essential today. The right to freedom of speech and expression, the right to assemble, the right to free assembly. These are all, these are not rights that are inherent to human beings, or that we all took for granted since the dawn of time. They're things that we have engineered for ourselves, as part of the evolving social contract. As society improves and becomes fairer and more just. And so in that way, I completely agree that it's not unnatural at all that this is something that is relatively new and perhaps did not exist 1,000 years ago, and that is not an argument for it not to exist today. So for people saying that privacy is, every society has a different conception of privacy, but to say that there are societies that don't think privacy is important at all, I think is in some ways a slightly regressive way of looking at things. The other thing I think is important though is, and where I push back a little, is history does repeat itself, and there are these patterns, that you can see through history. We go through cycles, but it's possible that we've already passed some kind of an inflection point when it comes to the ability for people, corporations, and especially governments to exert a huge amount of power simply through various forms of surveillance. And I use the word surveillance here in the broadest possible term, not in the sense of an intelligence agency doing mass surveillance, but I simply mean that includes everything. It includes even you putting up a CCTV camera on your, pointed, at your doorway but pointed away from your house. Right? That's a form of surveillance as well. Or you simply being able to look into your neighbor's house, that's a form of surveillance as well. I think technology has allowed us to reach this point where governments have the ability, if they flip a switch, if they're advanced enough, they can flip a switch and be aware of, they can have total surveillance quite easily. And that was never possible before. So there were practical limitations on the ability to conduct surveillance, which are fast disappearing, which for some governments, which are rich enough and advanced enough, have actually already disappeared. India is not at that point yet. I firmly believe that we're still way behind. If you look at the capabilities of of governments in richer and more advanced countries, they far outstrip what the Indian government can do. That being said, I think that's one reason why we should perhaps pause and think about whether this moment will go away, or it means that something has got to fundamentally change in the way we just think about privacy. And I think the single biggest privacy issue for us today is privacy as an offset to growing state power. I think that's the single most important issue. There's also the issue of corporate power. I'm not saying that's not important, but I think in the march of human history, I think if you have to pick one issue where this is most important, I'd say it's about the centralization of state power and the concentration of state power.
So I thought what we do is take a few examples and we'll just split between the two. So certain types of technologies that are changing the way in which we think about privacy. And the first one that I want to pick up, just completely at random, is just this whole concept of recommendation, right? So we all love the fact that if we have read a book and we have to report it online, when we go back online, we will find a really nice recommendation of another book to read. And some of these recommendations are super spot on. They're absolutely accurate, and you'll wonder how did the algorithm, because it's an algorithm, triangulate all those various interests of mine and come up with this particular suggestion, which is so accurate. And we see this everywhere. I mean, we've got recommendations in terms of where to eat, you've got recommendations in terms of where to go, we've got, if you land in a place, we'll have recommendations for the things to do when you land in the place, and these happen like magic. And even though it feels slightly creepy, we've all gotten to the point where we've gotten used to it. In fact, we've gotten to the point where we've gotten used to the fact that if you've booked a ticket and the ticket is in your Gmail, that it will automatically pop up in your calendar. And if it doesn't pop up in your calendar, you'll be worried as to what's gone wrong. Right? The reason why all this happens is because there are algorithms in the background that are tracking almost everything that you do in order to provide you this very finely tuned experience that matches with your preferences. And the amount of things that we do online today has allowed this to grow exponentially. And so the triangulation is so fine that sometimes these computers know us better than we know ourselves. And the best example of that was the Target incident. I don't know how many of you heard about the Target incident. Okay, let me just tell you. Essentially, there was a gentleman who was sitting at home doing pretty much nothing, and he gets a coupon from Target. The coupon said that this is some vouchers or something like that for the new entrant into your family that's about to come. Of course, this is a much married man. His daughter, he has a daughter. The daughter's a teen, and he has no clue what this is about. And eventually, it turns out that Target has got an algorithm that has figured out that in the second trimester, women prefer to use unscented shampoos or oils or soaps or something like that over scented. And when it noticed the switch, of course, this was in the household, and so it came to the home and not to the individual in question, they actually automatically sent this voucher. And at that time, it's maybe urban legend, but even the girl didn't know she was pregnant. And that's really the creepiness of the extent to which these algorithms are getting things right. And the beautiful thing about that is this is not something that anyone actually figured out other than the algorithm by itself. And that's really the power of these, of the way in which these engines work. And so, we've got social media companies and e-commerce companies building up these huge profiles of us, which are then weaponized, as we saw in the context of the US elections. So, In this first example, the point I wanted to make was that there is a very, very fundamental trade-off between convenience and all the negative consequences that could come of allowing algorithms to know too much. I don't believe there's malice on either side, but I do believe that sometimes we go into this without fully appreciating the trade-off, and it's really important to do that.
So don't you think so one of the things that the internet and e-commerce has made possible is just the increase in choice. Today, I mean, simply because you have aggregators who can bring together merchandise from all over a country or all over the world so easily, it means much better consumer choice, which is great for us. We all like that. We like the fact that when we go on Amazon and we want to buy a pair of scissors, instead of having to go to the stationery store and have 2 pairs to choose from, we have 25 pairs to choose from. And the flip side of that, of course, is having to navigate that that much choice. In which case, recommendations and curation really comes in.
And also,
the way I see it,
it's allowed people who otherwise would not have got a market to get a market.
Exactly. So I really think that curation based on your your preferences and so on it's something that has to exist. I don't think that we can take that away because if we want choice, that also means that we can't spend unlimited amounts of time making comparisons between all of those choices and trying to figure out what actually works for us. We need someone to help us with that. And that someone is not going to be a human beyond a point. It's simply not scalable when you're talking about hundreds of millions of products and billions of people. And that way, I think it's essential. The question is, what are the safeguards that you need? And I think there are some companies that are already thinking about ways to do this. And what they're trying to figure out, I think, is, so you use the word creepy, and I think that is what really I think upsets a lot of people, right? When you find a recommendation that's creepy, when there's a recommendation that's actually good, it delights you, right? And it's something that you see as a positive. The moment it seems creepy is when there's a backlash.
But the creepy ones are really always the best ones because they know you better than you know yourself. And if you want to constrain that power, you're actually constraining the ability of this technology to do the best that it can for you.
So perhaps that might be true, but maybe that's the trade-off then that we need to make. That you give the algorithm enough data to make good recommendations but not creepy ones. And I think there we need to figure out what creeps us out, right? As a society and as a people, what is it that creeps us out? There must be some lines, they will be different for each person, but there are perhaps some lines that exist. And I know, for example, that Google right now, internally, one of the things that they are really emphasizing is, search is their bread and butter, right? And recommendations based on search. So their endeavor is to try to build internal silos of a kind where if you are looking for food, it will throw up recommendations based on your food-related searches that you have done in the past, and not try to correlate a lot of different data points to arrive at a conclusion which might be absolutely right, but might end up creeping you out. So if you're an American and you listen to Southern music, is it going to recommend fried chicken to you? That's the kind of thing that creeps people out and makes them unhappy because it feels like the algorithm is jumping to conclusions about you. But on the other hand, if you did search for a lot of Southern recipes, then sure, maybe Southern fried chicken is something that that would interest you and wouldn't creep you out. So drawing those kinds of silos and restraining the algorithm is perhaps one way of maybe navigating that line.
Should we go to the next one? Should we do?
Yeah, so of course, where this becomes hard is something like facial recognition, and I think that's really important to talk about because it's it's been in the news in many countries for many different reasons, mostly bad, but I think it's also worth thinking about whether there are some good uses of this. Everyone knows that the ability to do mass facial recognition has existed for a while. Police departments and intelligence agencies have been using it for a very long time. But today you have the ability where you can buy a 1,500 rupee camera which connects up to the cloud and can do facial recognition at a level that was only possible with a supercomputer, say 5 or 10 years ago. And the question of how to navigate that and what the appropriate controls are has, I think, everyone really divided. I haven't seen something divide people this much in the recent past. Europe is thinking about banning it completely for 10 to 15 years until just a blanket ban on all facial recognition in the whole of Europe until they can figure out whether this is a technology that can even be controlled. And on the other hand, you have a country like China that's using it quite indiscriminately for surveillance to repress people in areas like Xinjiang, but also using it arguably in a beneficial way. If when it comes to the coronavirus outbreak, they have supposedly been able to track individuals who went out of the containment zone, either on purpose or accidentally, and have been able to track them across half the country to back to their homes or wherever, and have managed to quarantine them and prevent further infections. Right? In a way that would have been impossible even a few years ago, and would be impossible today in most countries if if they didn't have facial recognition, and if they didn't allow the interlinking of databases that would allow this kind of recognition to happen, not just across one city, but across the entire country. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but the fact is that in India right now, there are quite a few police departments, I think, that are starting to use it, and there's definitely scope for us to think about the possible harms in much more detail.
And I don't know if anyone will be able to live without this convenience, but ever since they dropped the button, the iPhones can only be open like this, right? That's facial recognition. And when we have the convenience of actually just looking at your phone and having it unlock and to your face and not to anyone else's face. If I try to do it when I'm shaving, no, it won't open. That's a convenience that we're really used to. And as I don't know if you know this, but Bangalore Airport is evaluating facial recognition. You will perhaps potentially be able to walk through those lines with none of the inconvenience that you currently have as you go in the morning. And I don't know how long we will put up with our resistance to the privacy challenges of facial recognition when we look at the conveniences.
Absolutely. So I just flew in this morning from Bangalore Airport, and the experience was amazing, simply because it's a smaller airport, and there are no queues. There are no queues for anything. You can breeze through check-in, security, and get to the gate from start to finish in about 10 minutes. That's it. Whereas Bangalore Airport or Delhi Airport is, it's painful to even think about the process you'll have to go through, especially if you're flying in peak time, early morning on a weekday, or pretty much any time on a weekend. It's utter madness. So if you have, it is a genuine problem. It's a huge loss of productivity. It's extremely tiring. If you've tried doing this with a baby, which I have in the recent past, you'll know exactly how painful it is. So if you have something that will help ease that and make it much simpler, there is actually a chance that I would use it. And I'm very aware of the trade-offs involved here, perhaps much more so. I possibly spend more time thinking about it and working on those issues than the average person, and I would still possibly just use that technology simply because it offers such a huge improvement in convenience.
Just a last point on that. There's a technology company called Clearview AI. I'm not sure if many of you picked it up, but they're a company that's achieved remarkable breakthrough in accuracy of facial recognition, down to, I think, in the upper 90s. That's the level of accuracy they have, and that accuracy is even for a person in the background of an image. So what they did was they scraped images of all the social media sites in the world, maybe billions of images, and they have fine-tuned this algorithm such that when a law enforcement official comes to them and says, look, we've got this grainy picture, maybe a CCTV camera, but with the CCTV cameras, the angles are never good, and so you very rarely get the eyes apparently Clearview can find a match in a question of minutes. And this match, one of the examples that the New York Times had in its detailed coverage of the company was of a person who was in the background in the gym of someone else's photo. And so the police official could identify the person, the gym, went to the gym, spoke to the people in the gym and were able to trace this person. And this is allowing law enforcement, people from law enforcement, the ability to solve cases that they previously had sort of shut. These are the cases that were otherwise.
Yes.
That's okay.
Yeah.
All the way there, so it bounces. So it gives law enforcement the ability to open cases that were not solved, and actually sort of bring justice to the victims who have suffered. And it's really hard. As Clearview says, they're only going to be used for law enforcement, but you know that at some point in time there's going to be a financial incentive for some commercial use of this, and then that's sort of when the click factor starts coming.
Yeah, and I think fundamentally why a lot of us will think that that's creepy is because when we put that image up on social media, we did not put it up with the intention of it being used by law enforcement to track me down. It's that is, I mean, in some ways it's akin to what we were talking about earlier in terms of Google wanting to silo off the data used for an algorithm, recommendation algorithm, and I think that's again, I think one way to help negotiate the convenience and the advantages that this technology can give, because you can't hold the technology back. That's one thing that I think we've all come to realize over time, that once a technology exists, it will be used. Saying that, so which is why I find, for example, Europe saying we're just going to ban all facial recognition for 10 to 15 years. I find that to be perhaps maybe not the best way of approaching this kind of thing, because it is going to be used. You can't stop it from being used. That's how it has always been. If the government doesn't use it, private industry will use it. If your country doesn't use it, another country will use it. You need to kind of take it by the horns and try to figure out what is the best way of regulating it, rather than saying that you simply will not use it at all. And the reason why, for example, I'm comfortable with unlocking my phone using my face is because phone manufacturers designed that feature in a fairly thoughtful way. If you have a good enough phone, not an inexpensive phone, but in the premium phones, the ability to firstly the image relating to your face and the ability to carry out that matching is done on a separate chip, a separate secure chip, which cannot communicate directly with the rest of the phone. It can effectively only send back an unlock or don't unlock answer to the rest of the OS. So it is a physically and functionally separate part of the phone, right? So that's something that people have designed over time, because they realize that it's very important to keep that separate and effectively keep it offline, because this piece of hardware is actually not communicating with the internet, and therefore the data cannot be used for anything apart from the ability to unlock the phone. That's in the best kinds of implementation. This is exactly how it works. So I think those are great examples of being able to use the power of the technology while trying to restrain some of the downsides. But of course, this doesn't stop the police, or for that matter, any malicious actor from holding the phone up to your face when you're asleep and unlocking the phone. That's something you'll have to live with.
One last technology example, and this in many ways is the most creepy one. We've all got these smart assistants around our homes, Alexa and Echo, and quite frankly, all our phones. You either say "Okay Google" or you say "Hey Siri," and they open. Now all of these are smart assistants, digital assistants that have got to the point where they can actually understand you well enough to know that you are addressing that device, which means that they're listening. Right now all they're doing is essentially carrying out whatever you tell them to. They've got advanced speech recognition, so when you speak to them in a sentence like this, as opposed to in computer jargon and computer code, they can actually make sense. They can pass the sentence and understand what it is that you want them to do. But the problem with this, of course, is that if you've got a device that is in your home, that has got a speaker that is always on, and that is potentially always listening to you, it is recording things that are happening in your home. And you know, I guess the point, of course, is that all of these are designed with a trigger word. So it's when you say, "Hey Siri," that they wake up. But when you're having a conversation with someone, haven't there been times when suddenly your phone just automatically opens up and says whatever, yes or whatever? It's because sometimes when you say something which sounds like "Hey Siri," it triggers the phone again. And there was one incident which really brings the grief factor up quite high in the US, maybe two incidents, where Amazon was subpoenaed by law enforcement to provide them with Alexa data in order to solve a murder. The law enforcement believed that there was an Alexa instrument in the home when a murder was committed. They believed that the husband had committed it, and they believed that during the scuffle that took place, Alexa was potentially turned on and would have recorded what was happening, thereby giving them evidence in a murder case. So just pause for a moment, all of you who have Alexas and just your phones and everything in your home. This is potentially the extent to which your own devices that you used, that you bought for your own convenience could be used against you. Not that any of you is planning to commit murder, but just the principle. And then there's just this other layer that we lawyers love to throw into this. What about the guest who comes into your house, who happens to be sitting there, who happens to be in the same room where the Alexa is? You just told the Alexa, play me this music because I want some nice mood music. You have signed a contract with Amazon when you bought this equipment, and you have said, I agree to the fact that you will listen to me. That poor guest has not. And if I'm a guest, I don't have an Alexa, I will never have an Alexa. That just pushes it a little beyond the point for me. But any person's house that I visit, I potentially put myself in a situation where, without my consent, there is a device that is capturing information about me.
You have an iPhone though, so have you turned Siri off?
This is my personal iPhone bias, and it just comes with the way the incentives are aligned. Google is a services company. Their entire incentives are aligned with making you purchase more services or use them more. Apple is a hardware company. Their entire incentives are aligned with selling you more phones. And so their incentive is actually perfectly aligned with keeping this safer. I know he's got a Google and he's driving me into the conversation, but that's the way I go.
Now they are pivoting to becoming a services company as well. So you never know
the
the
problem is
incentives
China.
will change.
Ultimately, the problem is China. So if they're so dependent on China, they will do whatever China tells them beyond the point. And we've seen that on the privacy issues.
Yeah, absolutely. They've given up encryption keys to the Chinese government for Chinese users, not for other users. But I really think that home assistants are again a great example of a situation where I think a lot of the world has, like, I have one at home. I have a Google Home, at home, which came free with my ACT. ACT just threw it in free because I think Google was had some kind of a partnership with them. So I renewed my plan for a year, and they just threw in a free Google Home, and I was like, it's fine. I had my misgivings, and now it's just a part of the family. And my 2-year-old has figured out how to speak the hot word just about well enough so that Google can recognize him, and is actually able to operate basic commands, which is very creepy. And I do think that they, because of how inexpensive they are, they have embedded themselves in our lives without the social compact move and the legal system moving to the point where we can actually deal with a lot of the issues that could potentially be thrown up by this. I mean, I am comforted by the fact that the way these devices are engineered, again, it's a bit like the way facial recognition on a good phone works, which is that the detection of what is listening all the time is not in the cloud. It is physically on that device, and it isn't sending that data back all of the time, or it's not supposed to be. I'm not a software engineer, so I can't certify this. But the way it's supposed to work practically is that you have intelligence on board which can detect whether the hot word has been spoken, and it's only after the hot word has been accurately detected that it records and sends a clip to the cloud. But of course, we know that there are many ways this can break down. Maybe they're not doing what they say they're doing. It's also possible that it gets accidentally triggered. And these are, I think, all great examples of the world into which we're headed. But moving the conversation forward, I think one of the things that always, as someone who loves digital services and is very much a digital native, but also cares about privacy and lives in the real world, one of the things that gives me a lot of comfort in navigating this entire world, this always on, always online world, is encryption. Right? And I think that is key. We all know that encryption is important, but I think not all of us realize how fundamental encryption is to the internet that exists today. So in the early to mid 90s, the internet was largely unencrypted, and the largest browser at the time, which was Netscape, wanted to implement encryption, strong encryption, because they wanted the internet to be a means for e-commerce. They actually wanted to facilitate real-world transactions of the internet. And you cannot have e-commerce without encryption, because you can't send credit card details and payment authorizations and so on in unencrypted form. So they wanted to move the internet forward. It wasn't only about communications, it was really about e-commerce. And at the time, the United States had export controls, which basically classified any even reasonably strong encryption as a weapon, and restricted its export. So Netscape at the time, I think this was 95 or 96, had to come up with two different versions of the browser. A US version with strong encryption, and a rest of the world version with very weak encryption that the NSA could break very easily. Right? So that was the state of the world, which meant that there was very little confidence that the business world and that common users had in being able to use the internet as a tool of e-commerce. But that changed because there was a lot of lobbying, and the US saw that the internet was very important and would become pretty much the medium for all commerce and communications over the next 2 decades. And so they actually changed their laws. They made it possible for American companies to actually build encryption into their products, strong encryption. And that really laid the foundation for the internet we have today, where we are used to the idea of secure communications, being able to use your credit card in a reasonably secure way, right? As long as you don't make a mistake in who you give your details to. It's actually very rare for your credit card details to be compromised in transit, as long as you don't work with shady sites. As long as you stick to trusted sites, the fact is that because of the way the internet is architected and how good encryption is, it's almost impossible for someone to actually intercept those details. But I think most of us encounter encryption in the context of communication and WhatsApp, because WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. And I really think that it's an absolute fundamental building block of just the internet and our digital lives, because as we were talking about earlier, with once all communications are flowing over the internet and not over, say, just a regular telephone line, it's possible to have total surveillance. It's possible for a government to actually intercept communications lines at these key points where all of them connect, and basically undertake mass surveillance where they record everything that everyone is speaking all the time. And the only thing that stops that from happening is strong encryption, and specifically end-to-end encryption. And it's great to see the march of the forward march of end-to-end encryption. Which started with Signal and moved to WhatsApp. It's actually an unheralded huge public good that WhatsApp chose to adopt end-to-end encryption when it did, because it didn't have to do that. It was already quite successful. They could have continued with other forms of encryption. But the fact is that they chose to implement end-to-end encryption in a very strong way, which I think is really, really change the way things work. But of course, there is now a strong pushback against encryption from governments for good and bad reasons. And I think you had some thoughts on the flip side of this.
So just to be completely clear, I completely endorse what Vinay said. That and I've written about it numerous times, saying that we cannot at any cost break into encryption. There is this whole push from the government to break it for law enforcement reasons. They want to allow traceability of messages. Who initiated that fake news message? I would like to trace it back to that person and punish them. And that's really the push for breaking into encryption. And it's really important, I think, not so much just for us, but it's really important for journalists, right? Journalists rely on their sources being anonymous. It's really important for whistleblowers. If you're making a whistleblowing complaint against someone, you've got to be confident that as you make the complaint, there's no recrimination against you. And there are people who are suffering abuse who need helplines. If they sort of use this as a helpline, they do really need to be sure it's safe, otherwise they will get abused. But any completely safe place, as much as it can be used by people for good, it is a magnet for people who want to do bad. And just yesterday, I read a report that was issued in the web conference in 2019 in San Francisco that talked about the way in which the rise in child sexual abuse imagery correlates to the growth in secure networks. And when I say rise, this is a 50% year-on-year growth, and that's what the statistics are. When it comes to video imagery, it is a 350% growth in the last 2 or 3 years.
Child trafficking also.
So what the report captures is just the images, and of course you know that behind the images is the trafficking, right? And so we're reaching a point where encryption is, and the other really remarkable statistic in the report that really, it really cuts you to the quick, is that 80% of the images that were picked up have never been picked up by the software before, which means this is new content that's being created. Now, what is the correlation between the two? The fact is that if you create a space which is so incredibly secure that it withstands law enforcement's ability to break into it, you will find that there are people who will subvert it for their evil intentions. And the reason I'm making this point is that as much as I love privacy, as much as I love anonymity, the thought of that space being used to inflict this kind of trauma on a child is something that I can't countenance. And it's really important to think of these issues in stark contrast, because the numbers are real, the volume of information is, and as much as people say that this is only the information that's being reported, I disagree. I think technology, just having a smartphone which can record high definition video, upload it to the internet in a matter of minutes, is a technology that didn't exist 10 years ago. And so anyone in their backyard can do this to a child. And if there is an audience for it, they will actually supply that audience. And so we have to think of the anonymity, privacy and security issue in that context.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And if I can just add very quickly, I think the problem also is that with a lot of people who do talk about privacy being the single most important thing, perhaps don't take into account the fact that law enforcement, the usual counter to strong encryption is that it's important for privacy, and law enforcement has other ways of tracking down criminals, right, which don't involve directly tapping someone's device or having direct access to their communications. But the fact is that in a lot of countries, like India for example, police departments are vastly under-resourced, and there is no way to just change that overnight. You can't just immediately train all of the police stations across India and the best forensic tools and give them the best equipment. It's simply not possible. We are not a rich country. We are a poor country. Whether we like it or not. It doesn't feel like that sitting here, but we are a very poor country. And the fact is that today in a country like India, police departments in villages are having to deal with crimes where it is essential that they are able to know what communication is happening between the criminals to solve a kidnapping or a robbery or a murder, and they have simply no way to access this information, and no one is telling them of alternative ways to investigate and so on. So the law enforcement problem is a legitimate problem. The answer to that may not lie in breaking all encryption, but it's important to acknowledge that it's a very serious problem. And it's a very serious problem that has been caused by technology, because it has created these spaces, it has created these tools that's made it easier for people to coordinate for the good and also for bad. And if law enforcement doesn't have a way to counter that, then our collective security is going to suffer as a result.
We've got tons more examples, but Anand tells me I've got to allow you guys to ask questions as well. So, okay, there are questions. We'll just do it quickly one-on-one. There is this other school of thought that accumulates questions, but we'll just do it one-on-one.
First of all, on the privacy and terms of service, any app or anything you download, first of all, it comes with some tons of pages, and nobody can make out anything out of that. Okay, so is there possible that you just summarize something? Because this state versus this state, many of those things are very generic. They have nothing to do really with privacy. So a very short summary, so we all understand, instead of having conditions apply kind of a statement somewhere. This is number one. Secondly, the fear of technology it also arises from social inequality between the ruled and the ruler. Today the government might want access to encrypted information, apparently for fighting crime, blah blah blah. But what happens when an authoritarian government goes against the others just because you are on the other side of the table? It's got nothing to do with law enforcement. Thirdly,
can you make that
last point.
No,
The 5G technology, some new technology is going to remove the possibility of encryption is what I read. I'm not very up to date on that.
No, it's quantum, but the new encryption will come. But they will just sort of quickly, you've touched on something which is a raw nerve, and I speak now for another hour, which is consent. I believe consent is state. And I even if I do summarize it for you, I just throw a question back at you. Would you read it? Because today we download so many apps. None of us read, and I'm a privacy lawyer. I don't read the terms and conditions of all the apps I do. We've got to fundamentally think of a new way to do that. The second question?
So on the second question, which was, the second one was on socially. Okay, so firstly on the first question, I had a point as well, which is perhaps one way of doing it is consent intermediaries and so on, which is basically you need a digital friend to help you navigate the world of privacy policies and data sharing. Perhaps one way of doing that, which India is seriously thinking about, which could be revolutionary if it's actually implemented and implemented well, is to say that you have a separate entity whose job it is, who takes a license and whose job it is only to be your guide in this world to help you navigate these waters. And of course, happy to speak about it more offline, but I'm really sorry. The second question was on
I'm saying
what?
The law enforcement agencies can always make a.
Oh yes, yeah. No, I think that there's only one way to fix that, which is you need better public institutions. You need public institutions that are harder to subvert, and I think you can see this to an extent in the US. I mean, it's very easy to be cynical about the US right now, but if you look at what has been happening for a while now, and definitely over the last 4 to 5 years, public institutions which are part of the government have in many cases stood up and refused to be used as political tools, at the expense of their careers, at great personal expense and professional expense. They have stood up. And really, I think the only way is to build those kinds of public institutions. And you see it happening in India as well, actually. If you look at, again, the last 5 years, you do have quite a few examples of public institutions and public servants who have stood up and said, you know what, I have a job and I'm going to do it properly as I was expected to. it doesn't matter whether I'm told to do otherwise. I know what my duty is. And I think that's really the only way to prevent that kind of abuse. It cannot be done merely through a law. You have to build that culture.
The lady there.
I think there was a question there which came.
Yeah, where does blockchain?
Sir, mic, sir, please, mic.
Just that.
So I think she
That lady-
had a
We'll
question.
answer that as well.
Yeah.
Hi. So my question is that when you say that end-to-end encryption exists and you're happy that it's there and that makes you feel a little better while using all these technologies, but in the case of WhatsApp itself, like people have conversations, and I personally have had conversations where one of my friends is saying I want to buy a bag, and the next time I go to Instagram and I see ads of bags. On Facebook there are ads of bags. I have told a friend that I want to vacation in Croatia, and I think we've had this conversation before. And I see home rentals in Croatia. So when they say that they're end-to-end encrypted, like what is the extent of that encryption? Is it actually end-to-end encrypted or not? And how do we understand that? And the second question I had was that when you say that you guys mentioned that recommendations are good and you want them, but you don't want the creepy ones. So you're saying that the accuracy of an algorithm should be dialed down to 70% instead of 90%? And is that what you're saying?
So, should I
Yeah.
first? So, see, I think with this, there are two, very common, experiences that people talk about in public, which I still don't think happen. Those are, number one, that WhatsApp content, the content of your chats is somehow read by WhatsApp. I don't believe that happens. And
I
also,
will tell you it's not.
yeah.
I will tell you categorically, having seen the way it works, it does not.
Yeah, and it's been tested by a lot of security professionals whose job it is to break these, break these systems, and no one has broken it because it is real end-to-end encryption. That is not to say that it cannot be broken in the future by some new type of computer. All of that is possible. But right now, is the promise of WhatsApp, or for that matter Telegram or Signal, is the promise accurate? Yes, it is. And I, as far as I'm aware, to the full extent of my knowledge, it is true that it is fully encrypted. And even WhatsApp itself cannot read those chats. And if it cannot read those chats, there's no way it can share that content with others or with their own properties as well. And I think that what happens in a lot of these cases, the second misconception is that people think that their phones are listening to them all the time. And this is something that a lot of people have talked about, even like technology professionals, quite a few of them believe that, my phone was just sitting there and I spoke about this thing only once with one person, and recommendations or something or ads started showing up related to that issue. The fact is that many people have proven that, I will tell you as a lawyer, that simply the extent of liability of those companies, if they ever did something like that. Leave aside in India, in the United States, they would have their pants sued off them, okay, by people, by consumers there, and they would stand to lose billions and billions of dollars. And it's a simple cost-benefit analysis. And I think both of us work in that space. We understand the calculus of companies, and even if you assume that they are the most immoral actors, okay, they are the worst possible people, and all they care about is money. From a simple cost-benefit analysis, in pure money terms, it makes no sense to do that. To listen to people all the time without their permission or knowledge. And secondly, from a computational perspective, it's been proven to be basically impossible. It's just too intensive.
So we always tend to confuse correlation and causation, and this is an example of correlation and causation. Everyone I saw nodding while this example was given. I would just urge you, as this happens to you, just think back. Did you send an email to your friend saying you wanted to go to Croatia? Did you do something on the actual browser which would have given them an inclination that you wanted to buy something? Because very often, if you think back beyond that first immediate, I had a conversation and it occurred, you will find examples that happen. And if you're still not convinced, there's a wonderful episode of Reply All, which is a podcast where guys actually take these sort of questions and try and solve them, where they go through exactly this question, that my phone was listening to me and it told me this, and they completely debunk it, or not completely. They're not able to exactly prove it, but they throw enough doubts that all of you who were nodding perhaps will have a rethink.
What about WhatsApp and the Israel company?
So, I
Can
think
you
there
go
was a question.
offline for that, please? We have an next section.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.